Assalamu alaikum. Hello everybody. The title of this lecture is Bakhtinian Literary Criticism, and I am Dr. Maha Sallam, Associate Professor of English Literature at the Department of English Language and Literature, Faculty of Arts, Ain Shams University. Today's lecture concerns the Russian thinker, philosopher, intellectual, critic, historian Mikheil Bhartin. The dates of Mikheil Bhartin are 1895, 1975. So he was born towards the end of the 19th century and he lived for almost 3/4 of the 20th century and is considered one of the major inspirations of modern and contemporary critical theory. The critic David Lodge describes Bhartin's career as, quote, an extraordinary story of outstanding intellectual achievement in the face of every imaginable obstacle and discouragement, unquote. Of course, the reference in this quotation by David Lodge is to the hardship of living under the totalitarian regime of Joseph Stalin in Russia, and we will talk more about this historical context of the life of Bhartin later today. Bhartin's work is not just related to critical theory, but he has studied a number of fields such as history, sociology, philosophy, psychology, linguistics, and literature. Now, some of the major titles of Bhartin in relation to the field of literary theory and practical criticism include, number one, Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics. The second title, Rabelais and His World. The third title is The Dialogic Imagination. Bhartin had a great influence on Western literary theory. He first became known in the West in the late 1960s after the translation of his work from Russian language into the French language and later into the English language. His work on language in particular was of special importance to the theories of structuralism and post-structuralism. According to Bhartin, language is fundamentally multiple in its meaning. This multiplicity of language is dialogic in nature because the multiple meanings of language arise from the fact that any utterance, whether an oral utterance or a written utterance, carries the traces of other utterances that have preceded it and that might come after it. Thus, the work of such big names as Roland Barthes, Jacques Derrida, and Julia Kristeva on the important critical concept of intertextuality, the concept which studies the relation between different texts. Each text is supposed to be related to the texts that preceded it and those that came after it. This concept of intertextuality can be seen as derived from the work of Mikheil Bhartin. Also, the influence of Bhartin's work on Western literary theory includes his important work on genre theory. This work helped in the development of the theory of narrative, especially as it concerns the genre of the novel. Significantly, Bhartin always emphasized the interconnections between three things: number one, language; number two, literature; and number three, historical context, whenever he performed an analysis of a literary text. He studied the interconnections between language, literature, and historical context, believing that none of these items can be studied in isolation. We need to take in consideration here that Bhartin's historical vision is based on continual change and evolution. He considers that history is in a state of change and evolution all the time. In other words, he believes in what we call continual becoming, which requires that final conclusions and interpretations be perpetually deferred in favor of an ongoing potentiality. For example, according to Bakhtin and his argument, you can never, when you are studying a work of literature or when you are studying history itself, you can never come to a final conclusion and be 100% certain that this conclusion will remain stable and will never be challenged by others who may come after you and study the same text or the same historical period. According to Bakhtin, we can only do our best to reach the best possible interpretation under the given circumstances and at a given moment in time, but this interpretation, whether of a literary text or of a historical reality, can never be considered as final, and we can never say that this is the only correct interpretation of this or that text or period of history, because there is always the potentiality of change, and we need to do our best under the present circumstances and expect that changes can and will happen. Now, Bakhtin's insistence on the intrinsic multiplicity and the ideological diversity of language, as well as on the evolutionary nature of history, these are two fundamental preoccupations underlying all his work. Whenever we are talking about Bakhtin's work, we need to keep these two concepts in mind, these two basic foundations. About language, it has an intrinsic multiplicity and an ideological diversity. And nature has history has an evolutionary nature. So we need to keep this in mind whenever we are reading the work of Bakhtin. Now, while we come to the end of the introduction to our lecture, this slide is like the end of the introduction, and then we will go later to a detailed discussion of the critical concepts of Bakhtin as regards literary criticism. We need to put in mind the historical context in which Bakhtin conducted his work. And namely, we refer here to the tumultuous cultural and political world of Russia during and after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, with all the emancipatory and revolutionary potential of the 1920s. And then we also need to keep in mind how this era came to an end and took an oppressive turn under the Stalinist totalitarian regime of the 30s and the 40s, and how this historical context played an important role in shaping the major terms of Bakhtinian literary theory and in shaping the manner in which he will present to us his argument and his work. So he has lived during a revolutionary era, and always in times of revolution there are big hopes, we can call them sometimes utopian hopes, of freedom and equality and the universal welfare for everybody. But sometimes, such as the case in Russia, and there are many examples in history, sometimes revolutions take a wrong turn, and instead of fulfilling their potential, they take a turn towards oppressive regimes. And this is what happened when Joseph Stalin came to the rule of the then called Soviet Union. Joseph Stalin led a totalitarian oppressive regime in which nobody was allowed any freedom of expression, and censorship was the rule of the day, and people were persecuted, and there was no chance to have any oppositional voices. There was only the single voice, the mono voice of the authority of Stalin and his regime. And you can imagine how difficult it will be for any intellectual, including Bakhtin, to be living and working under such circumstances, especially if they do not want to get in trouble. On the one hand, they do not want to get in trouble with the authorities, and on the other hand, they want to keep their freedom and they want to keep their intellectual integrity without getting under the cover of the totalitarian regime and without catering for the needs of such a regime. So we will see how Bakhtin was able to manage under these difficult historical circumstances. Now we come to the focus of this lecture, Bakhtinian literary criticism in general, having got to know his major preoccupations and the times during which he was living. Let us summarize the major terms of Bakhtinian literary criticism as three terms. Number one, the Carnivalesque; number two, Heteroglossia; and number three, the Chronotope. Now, let us discuss each of these terms in details. For example, the Carnivalesque. This term was introduced by Bakhtin as part of his study of the work of the French author, the novelist François Rabelais, who was living in the 16th century. And when Bakhtin studied the work of Rabelais, he was very much interested by the way Rabelais exploited the transgressive energies of the medieval carnival, and he used these energies in order to subvert the rigid, single-voiced, dark and authoritarian rule of the medieval Catholic Church. Now let us keep in mind that Rabelais in the 16th century was living under an authoritarian, strict, rigid regime that didn't allow any opposition, and we mean the medieval church when we talk about this regime of the 16th century. On the other hand, we have an author, Bakhtin, living in the 20th century and suffering under the oppression of the Stalinist regime of the Soviet Union. So we can very well imagine how, for Bakhtin, the work of Rabelais would be like a discovery. It would open windows to a method of how to subvert the authority of an oppressive regime in an indirect manner, without getting in trouble, without being put in prison or even executed, such as many opponents of the Stalinist regime suffered. Now, let us remember that carnivals are a fact of life in many societies. They are days of celebration or times of celebration, festivities, in which everybody takes part, the rich and the poor, the women and the men, different classes, different ideological positions. They take part in these carnivals. There are street processions and mass entertainment. People have a vacation from work and they get to dress all sorts of costumes. Sometimes they are disguised as hooligans and sometimes as clowns. And they laugh and play and dance and sing. And the everyday rules are cut and broken very easily during the times of Carnival. So if you are writing a novel, such as Rabelais when he was writing his novels, and you include the carnival and the carnivalesque imagery, you can be using this imagery to show that we can do whatever we want during a carnival, and we can transgress all the rules and the boundaries that the church is forcing us to follow in our everyday. So maybe this will give us some hope that one day we can rebel against the authority of the church. This was the reading of Bakhtin to Rabelais. The works of Rabelais have been already present and they have been read by many people before Bakhtin came, but Bakhtin was the first to see this potential of the carnivalesque being used as a revolutionary imagery in the work of Rabelais. We all know, as we mentioned, that by definition, This imagery of the carnivalesque involves a transgression of the boundaries between social classes and an overruling of all the codes of behavior, the normative and prescriptive codes, offering instead of all these strict rules, we are offered a life-affirming and egalitarian joy and happiness and exuberance, and this sentiment does not respect any rules, whether political rules or religious rules, and allows free mingling among the representatives of diverse groups and individuals belonging to different affiliations. So during carnival time, the official rules are suspended temporarily and a sense of freedom prevails. Such an atmosphere may involve disruptive, chaotic, or even violent acts to take place under the cover of universal festive license granted to the participants. So we can consider that the carnivalesque imagery within any work of literature will be closely related to themes of resistance, subversion, revolution, and to challenge of all forms of authority. Now, let us just remember how many times we have seen in movies that, for example, a murder is committed while people in the streets are having a carnival or a public celebration or a procession of any type, and maybe the victim is screaming and calling for help and nobody will listen to her or to him, and nobody will know that a murder is being committed. So this is just to give you an example how the times of carnival or other related festivities, it doesn't always have to be the carnival, these times can be used as a metaphor or an image linked to revolution, giving hope to the masses that maybe they can rebel one of these days against the rigid, oppressive authority that encumbers them. Now, while Bakhtin was studying Rabelais and studying the anti-authoritarian potentials of the carnival in Rabelais' work, he also underlines another point related to the carnivalesque. We will not consider this a separate point. It is closely related to the carnivalesque, which supports the argument that Rabelais was attempting to subvert the church authority in his writing. Now, all the time, the church is focusing on the spiritual aspect of human beings rather than the physical or material aspects. We are supposed to strengthen our spiritual aspects, and we are supposed not to succumb to the needs of the body or the needs of the flesh or the physicality that we share with animals and beasts and so on. So, when you read Rabelais and you discover that in his writing there is always an emphasis on the physical aspect of the human body, how the human body functions every day, the bodily functions such as eating and excretion and giving birth and copulating and even dying. These functions, these everyday functions, are emphasized and highlighted and described in graphic details in Rabelaisian writing. And this has not been very common in the writings of the 16th century, nor in many other centuries. So Bakhtin read in this insistence on the physicality of the body that Rabelais was trying to challenge the authority of the church, because even since ancient times in classical literature, during the Greek and Roman times and the early medieval times, even up till the Elizabethan worldview in Shakespearean drama and such, we always considered a form of correspondence between the small body or the microcosm, the body of the human being, and the macrocosm or the bigger body of the universe or the world. For example, the head would be corresponding to the king or to royalty or authority and so on. So when you find someone like Rabelais focusing especially not only on the physicality of the body, but even especially on the lower part of the body, like he is pointing to how these lower classes, how these masses, the commoners, the uneducated, how these people they have the real force to have an insurgency or an uprising or a revolution and to upset the whole system of authority and to put a new system in place. So this is the way that Bakhtin was reading Rabelais. He read in him a subversive, revolutionary author who was able to hide his subversion under the imagery of the carnival and under the imagery of the grotesque description of the human body. And in this case, he was able to escape the censorship of the Catholic Church in the same manner that Bakhtin hoped to escape the censorship of Stalinist Russia. Now, everybody agrees to the subversive or revolutionary or anti-authoritarian potentials of the Carnivalesque imagery. But some people, some critics, such as Terry Eagleton, they pointed out that these subversive potentials, they are used actually by the official authority, not by the masses. And Terry Eagleton here was referring to the way that official authority, sometimes in order to divert the anger of the masses and point them to other channels rather than revolution, they allow the masses to celebrate different festivities, they allow them to have mass entertainment, and they allow them on several public occasions to go to the streets and dance and enjoy themselves, just to let them let off steam, as we say, or they allow them to watch football matches, and maybe after the match the fans of each team are going to get into some trouble or even violent acts with the fans of the opposite team and so on. And according to Eagleton, it is the government or the ruling authority that allows these things to happen as a form of catharsis in order to make sure or to guarantee that the people will not rise against the authority of the regime. So this, of course, concept of catharsis is familiar to us ever since the times of Aristotle's Poetics, when he was describing the Greek tragedies, and he was considering that if a tragedy is really great, then it will the events of the plot will raise emotions of pity and fear in the audience, and towards the end of the play, after these emotions reach a climax, then the end will happen and the downfall of the tragic hero will occur, and then the audience are going to go home, but they will feel like they are washed or cleansed or purged out of all the excessive emotions that have been aroused by the play, and they will feel relaxed, as if what happened was the just thing to happen. The tragic hero was a noble man, but he had a tragic flaw, and he deserved, in all justice and fairness, to suffer the downfall at the end because of his tragic flaw. So this concept of catharsis, as we say, is supposed to be used by the authorities, according to people such as Terry Eagleton. They are the ones who use the carnival in order to cause catharsis in the masses and to prevent the revolution. But either way, nobody is contesting the revolutionary potential of the Carnivalesque, and Bakhtin's work is always featured and described by literary critics, contemporary ones. They always describe it as calling for a form of ambivalence, like there is always an open-endedness. We agree about something, but it can be, yes, this is a revolutionary technique, the carnival, but it can be used by the masses if they are having leadership, organic leadership that can move them, or it can be used by the ruling regime, and either way it deserves to be examined when you are reading a work of literature and you find that it is using the carnival, or even when you are analyzing a movie, any cultural artifact, in fact, maybe you can try to apply this concept and to see to what purpose is it being used or channeled, and who exactly is controlling the deployment of carnivalesque imagery in the work you are studying. Now we come to a second concept considered by many to be the key concept of Bakhtinian literary criticism. This is the concept of heteroglossia, and it is applied mainly to Bakhtin's theory of the novel, which argues that the distinguishing feature of the novel as a genre is the way it incorporates the various languages of society into its own discourse. When you are reading a novel, there is a diversity of voices, or what we call heteroglossia, multiple languages. These multiple languages enter the novel and they organize themselves into a structured artistic system within the novel, and they are not just languages in the form of a dialogue exchanged between characters, but they also have a specific socio-political connotation, each language representing an entire worldview. Now, when we are talking about this heteroglossia, or the different languages in the novel, in a really good novel, we have an interaction, a dynamic interaction, or a dialogue between these or among these different languages, and this dialogue is dramatizing the ideological struggles of the society represented by the language. So Bakhtin really respects the novel. This is his favorite literary genre, because it has this feature of heteroglossia. It has this potentiality to give us a multiplicity of voices and to show us how they interact, and thus to represent a full picture of the different ideological struggles of a certain society. Now, when studying the history of the novel in his work on this genre, Bakhtin defines two different types of novel. He says that when the novel begins in the late 17th and early 18th century and it starts to develop, it develops along two different lines. The first line of development is the line that Bakhtin does not like much. It is the line which has inhibited or rejected this potentiality of heteroglossia. It is the line of the novel that we call didactic. It gives us a single voice, a unified voice, a monologic literary voice. And this type of novel tries to suppress or to inhibit any multiplicity of voices, like it inhibits heteroglossia. So if you are reading a novel of this first line of development, you will notice that only one argument is being allowed to be represented to us through all the different characters of the novel and through the different events of the plot and the situation and the imagery and everything, as if it is not really a novel that allows for an interaction of different opinions. It seems to be more like a lesson, teaching us a lesson, or as if I am reading an opinion article in a newspaper or online, which is advocating or supporting a particular point of view and is attacking the opposite points of view and not allowing them any chance to express themselves. So this is the first line of development of the novel, and of course this is not the type of novel that Bakhtin is interested in. The second line of novel, this is the line which features what he calls an encyclopedic comprehensiveness, like it comprehends different points of view, different ideological positions. It allows all the many voices, all the multiple and diverse voices in society to be having their place inside the world of the novel, so that the reader can read and he or she can later on, after they finish the novel, they can form their own opinion depending on all the multiplicity of voices that have been equally represented to them. Now, this second line of the novel was the line to which the novels of Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist, they belong to this line. And of course, Bakhtin actually analyzed the works of Dostoevsky and considered them to be heteroglossic novels par excellence. And maybe I can add that we have our Egyptian Nobel Prize laureate, the famous Naguib Mahfoud. In most of his works, and in particular in the trilogy Al-Thulathiyya, he was representing a world of heteroglossia. He showed us people from different classes and people who have different political agendas and people who have different worldviews, the religious and the not so religious, the upper class, the middle and the lower classes, men and women, different generations, and how there was this generational gap and difference in the evolution of thought among people in different periods of time in the history of Egypt. So such authors as Mahfouz and Dostoevsky and others, they write heteroglossic novels. They are able to exploit to the full the potentiality of the novel to include all these multiple and diverse voices. And of course, let us remember that when Bakhtin is working on the novel, he is always interested in the historicity of all language use. According to Bakhtin, language is not a stable, static thing. It is historical, and it evolves and changes under different historical situations to be able to cope with the different needs of different historical contexts. Now we come to the last term of literary criticism of Bakhtin, the chronotope, and this term, which means the sense of time and space and the relation between them that informs any work of literature, this is of particular importance, especially when we remember that Bakhtin is very much interested in the relation between language, literature, and historical context. Now, according to Bakhtin, when he studies societies in general, he says that the most fundamental characteristic of any society is the attitude of this society towards space and time. And he says that the literature produced by this society reflects this attitude. So if I study the literature, for example, of the Russian society or the Egyptian society or any society, I can deduce from this study of literature the manner or the attitude in which this society thinks about time and space. And the chronotope, again according to Bakhtin's argument mentioned in his book The Dialogic Imagination, the chronotope is the organizing center of the narrative structure. The whole narrative structure is organized around this center that he calls the chronotope. And it is the place where the knots of the narrative events are tied and untied. We all the time know that the plot of the novel is a sequence of events, and these events, they begin sometimes in a quiet manner in the stage of the exposition, then they get complicated and they are tied into knots as if you are tying a rope, and we have several knots or several problems, and then towards the final stage of the narrative there is an untying of the knots, or what we call the denouement. So according to Bakhtin, the site or the place where the tying and the untying takes place, this is the chronotope. And it is very important to know that in a single novel we can have more than one chronotope. Sometimes we can have two chronotopes or more than two, and in this case there will be a dialogic interaction between the chronotopes. For example, in a novel such as Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, we have the Chronotope related to Europe and another one related to Africa. Europe in the novel is always referred to as the here and now of the narrative, whereas Africa in the narrative of Heart of Darkness is referred to as the distant place where past distant events have happened, and these two different chronotopes are in a state of dialogue during or throughout the narrative of Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Now, in conclusion, let us just mention that if you plan to use Bakhtinian literary criticism in your critical analysis of a given novel, then you can choose one of the concepts. You don't have, of course, to choose all the Bakhtinian concepts. You can choose the Carnivalesque or the Chronotope or the Heteroglossia, and you can apply it to the novel you are studying, and hopefully you will have great results doing that. Now we have a number of references, of course, to which this lecture is indebted. Some of the references are the work of Bakhtin himself, and others are works by critics such as Keith Booker or Michael Hallquist or David Lodge or others, and they are critics who have written biographies and commentaries and interpretations and applications of the work of Bakhtin. Thank you and good luck.